Good morning, brothers and sisters. As we return to the Wednesday portion of this week's study and progress in this part of the article that Uriah Smith had written, shall we ask our Heavenly Father for his direction and his guidance? As we open the word of the Lord, as we consider carefully those examples which are given us, shall we seek to come to understand so that we might better know that which the Lord would have us to understand at this time in Earth's history. Shall we now ask for his guidance in prayer? Loving Father in heaven, we thank you for the many blessings that you are providing. We thank you for all that you are doing in our lives, for the tests and the trials, for all that is occurring so that your will may be done. We ask, Father, for your forgiveness of anything that we have done that has not been right. We ask also, Father, for your blessing upon those in this meeting and those that may view this later. Direct us now, assist us so that we might come to understand more clearly that which you would have us to know. Help us, may our minds be open, may the Spirit guide us, may your angels protect us, may your will be done. For this we thank you and this we praise you, now and always in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, now we began yesterday considering this verse. Thus shall he do in the most strongholds with a strange God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory. And he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for gain. Smith's comment begins the system of paganism which had been introduced into France, as exemplified in the worship of the idol set up in the person of the goddess of reason, and regulated by a heathen ritual, which had been enacted by the National Assembly for the use of the French people, continued in force till the appointment of Napoleon to the Provisional Consulate of France in 1799. The adherents of this strange religion occupied the fortified places, the strongholds of the nation, as expressed in the verse. Now, of course, there are some that think that Smith was a prophet. I am not of their camp. I do not believe that Smith was a prophet. I understand fully that Mrs. White has stated that his book should be seen as, quote, God's helping hand. Yet what we are seeing here that happened in France at the end of that century became more of full effect by the time we get into the 20th century with that took place in Russia. So the paganism that was introduced in France became the paganism that we would see in Russia. Any other thoughts or comments on that?
Yeah, so, well, we know, of course, as we've talked about, that this France is prophecy in Revelation 11. But here, of course, this wouldn't apply to France.
Okay.
And we already looked at this verse in detail, that this is actually talking about. So when we're dealing with it says the papal power, he shall do in the most strongholds. We looked at this. This was the against the most strongholds, or against places of refuge, right? So which we take as God's word. So this is an attack upon God's word that we see in Revelation chapter 11. But here, the way that he's introducing this, or the way that he's addressing this, has to do with France, as worshiping a idol is completely different than what the Hebrew would actually be talking about in that context, right? So he's going to use false worship to attack God's word.
Right. Now, Smith continues, but that which serves to identify the application of this prophecy to France, perhaps as clearly as any other particular, is the statement made in the last clause of the verse, namely, that they should divide the land for gain. Previous to the Revolution, the landed property of France was owned by a few landlords in immense estates. These estates were required by law to remain undivided so that no heirs or creditors could partition them. But the Revolution knows no law. And in the anarchy that now reigned, as noted also in the 11th of Revelation, the titles of the nobility were abolished, and their lands disposed of in small parcels for the benefit of the public exchequer. The government was in need of funds, and these large landed estates were confiscated and sold at auction in parcels to suit purchasers. The historian thus records this unique transaction. The confiscation of 2/3 of the landed property of the kingdom, which arose from the decrees of the convention against the emigrants, the clergy, and persons convicted at the revolutionary tribunals, placed funds worth above 700 million pounds sterling at the disposal of the government. Now, no matter how we look at that, that is a lot of money. When did ever an event transpire, and in what country, fulfilling a prophecy more completely than this? As the nation began to come to itself, a more rational religion was demanded, and the heathen ritual was abolished. The historian thus describes that event. A third and bolder measure was the discarding of the heathen ritual and the reopening of the churches for Christian worship. And of this, the credit was wholly Napoleon's, who had to contend with the philosophic prejudices of almost all of his colleagues. He, in his conversations with them, made no attempts to represent himself a believer in Christianity, but stood only on the necessity of providing the people with the regular means of worship wherever it is meant to have a state of tranquility. The priests who chose to take the oath of fidelity to the government were readmitted to their functions, and this wise measure was followed by the adherence of not less than 20,000 of these ministers of religion who had hitherto languished in the prisons of France. Locard's Life of Napoleon, Volume 1, page 154. It's kind of interesting that Smith shifts quite a bit between different volumes about this period to support different points that he wishes to make. Thus terminated the reign of terror and the infidel revolution. Out of its ruins rose Bonaparte to guide the tumult to his own elevation, place himself at the head of the French government, and strike terror to the hearts of the nations. So is Smith, go ahead.
So when we started studying Smith's articles here, which did we start with? Which were, like, we started with chapter 12.
Right.
Which one did we start with first? Like what verse? I just don't remember. We had a specific date that we started of his articles. Do you remember which one? Because now he's to verse 40, but we started chapter 12. And this is what the date here is. Is this in March 21st, this one?
21st of March of 1871.
Yeah, and then he's going to get to chapter 12 on
the 16th of May of 1871.
Was it 16th of May?
Yes.
Wasn't there one dealing with some symbolic date that we had?
Yeah. This one coming 49 or 50 days after this article was on the 25th day of the second month of the biblical year.
Okay, yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, I was just trying to remember that. Sorry about that interruption.
No.
Okay,
yeah,
because we're going to come, because he's going to, so there's going to be, we're going to start in verse 40, so we got these 6 verses left. I'm just kind of thinking ahead. Anyway, okay, sorry.
No, our situation, when we looked at this with the 12th chapter, was it lined up with the 25th day of the second month on the biblical calendar, the rabbinic calendar, and the Islamic calendar.
Yeah. And it was May what?
May 16 on the Gregorian calendar, 4th of May on the Julian calendar.
So just dealing with some symbolic dates. So we missed our study on Sunday, right? Because I was in the mountains. And so yesterday we had study number 252. and that happened to fall on July 23rd. So you didn't intentionally miss Sunday so that you could line up 723 with 252, right?
No, I didn't.
Just, the 2520 starts in 723 BC. So it's kind of an interesting symbols there that aligned.
Yeah, that wasn't even on my mind.
Yeah, well, I know. Yeah, I realize that. Okay, anyway, we got to move to verse 40, I guess. Now, was there anything else about verse 39? Because we had gone through it.
Right.
We're going to run into some real problems when we get to verse 40 with Uriah Smith.
So here's verse 40. And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. So as we begin to segue into verses 40 to 45, here is Smith's presentation looking at this on verse 40. So at the time of the end, we've identified, shall the king of the south, paganism, push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him, question mark, king of the south, like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. And he shall enter into countries and shall overflow and pass over. Here is Smith in this first paragraph setting up his premise. After a long interval, the king of the south and the king of the north again appear on the stage of action. We have met with nothing to indicate that we are to look to any different localities for these powers from those which shortly after the death of Alexander constituted respectively the southern and the northern divisions of his empire. The king of the south was at that time Egypt, and the king of the north was Syria, including Thrace and Asia Minor. Egypt is still, by common agreement, the king of the south, while the territory which at first constituted the king of the north has been for the past 400 years wholly included with the dominations of the Sultan of Turkey. To Egypt and Turkey, then, we must look for a fulfillment of the verse before us. Now, here is Smith's Eastern question. Here is Smith's premise that we should consider his point relative to Turkey, even though Turkey has nothing to do with Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 8, Daniel 10, or even before this in Daniel 11. Why is he choosing to become so anti-biblical?
Well, he's simply following Josiah Litch. So he is presenting what he understands as the pioneer position.
Okay.
Right. And now Josiah Litch published it in, he published it in a few different places. I'm looking right now at Address to the Public and especially the Clergy, which was published in, when was this published? I'm not sure. Doesn't give the publishing date. But he's dealing, if I look in prophetic expositions, here, I'll do it there, because so we got in prophetic expositions, volume 2, he's going to the king of the south shall push at him, at whom the answer is the subject of prophecy in the preceding verses, the revolutionary government of France. So that was the view of Josiah Litch.
Okay.
Now we had gone through this before, but a lot of this stuff that Josiah Litch, a lot of the stuff that Smith is quoting from are actually direct quotes from Josiah Litch quoting Lockhart and so forth. So Smith himself is actually just quoting Josiah Litch.
Okay.
For the most part. I mean, he's obviously putting some of his own words in there, but he went through Josiah Litch's articles, I believe, and then just wrote out his explanation from Josiah Litch.
All right.
Now, so, I mean, we have the criticism of Smith. Why is he doing this? But this is, Smith isn't doing something unique. That is, he's not coming up with these ideas on his own. And he doesn't generally have original ideas. There's not much that you can see in what he's done that is his own take on things. So he's not really looking for new light. He's looking to establish old light. Now, of course, if he had looked at Miller, Miller would have a different view. So he's not telling us the process in why he decided these different views, or that different views exist. When it says Egypt is still by common agreement the king of the south, I'm not sure that matters, that common agreement occurs. Plus, also, he says we have met with nothing to indicate that we are to look at any different localities, which in fact we have had many things that would indicate we're not going to be looking literally at Egypt, right? We've moved into the end of paganism and the rise of the papacy. So if we're going to be looking at the king of the south, we'd have to be looking at who is spiritually the king of the south. And as we pointed out, if Sodom and Egypt symbolize France, then it would make no sense to apply literal Egypt here to the king of the south, or the king of the south to literal Egypt.
This is
the southern power. What's that?
This seems to be a common error, that people are taking symbolic stuff and applying it literally. Things that are symbolic and applying it literally, instead of lining it up with the historical applications.
Yeah. So we have a principle. I'm just trying to find the verse so that I quote it correctly. That's the word. Something to the effect, first, how's that verse go? That's basically, first you interpret something earthly and then something spiritual. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Not yet.
Because I've always just kind of paraphrased the verse, but I want to get it. Anybody know what verse I'm talking about? Where you first, I'm just trying to think of the words that are used, and I can't think of it.
Is it where we draw the idea? What is it? God shows us the end from the beginning, something.
Well, no, it's sort of, but this one is first that which is literal, and then that which is spiritual. But I think different words are being used. Like it's not going to be figurative.
It's 1 Corinthians 15, I think.
1 Corinthians 15. Okay.
Back to 42nd verse, I think.
Okay, let me see. Okay, yeah. So it's verse 40. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 15:46. Howbeit that which was not first, howbeit that was not first, which is spiritual, but that which is natural. That's the word, not earthly, but natural. And afterward, that which is spiritual. Now, of course, this is talking about our body, right? And there's this natural body that's sown, and then there's a spiritual body raised. But we apply this also prophetically. And the first man is of the earthy, and the second man is the Lord from heaven. And as is the earthy, such as are they that are also earthy. And as is the heavenly, such as they that are also heavenly. So there's this symbol of what is earthy and what is spiritual, what is earthy and what is of heavenly. So the principle here is that when we first understand Bible prophecy, we look at its application as is being applied in its historic application. And then we can see that we can apply the spiritual application. So we have the fall of Babylon, right? Literal Babylon is going to fall. The river Euphrates is going to be dried up, right? It's going to be redirected. Cyrus, he's going to enter, his army's going to enter into the middle of the city through this dried up Euphrates, and the two leaved gates will be open, right? That's going to be Daniel chapter 5, the fall of Babylon. So at the end of the world, when we have the fall of Babylon, we're going to have the river Euphrates dried up. Is it the literal river Euphrates that's going to be dried up during the seventh or the sixth plague, during the seven last plagues, the sixth plague specifically? So the river Euphrates is going to dry up. Are we looking for the literal river Euphrates drying up?
No.
Yeah, so that the kings of the east can come. No, we're not, right? Now, many people, Adventists, say, oh, the river Euphrates is drying up. So that somehow has something to do with Bible prophecy.
Right.
Which it does.
And the Golden Dome or whatever in Jerusalem, Islam and Israel. They're applying it literally.
Yeah, well, they're applying all of these nations and everything literally, like even Seventh-day Adventists, right? So they don't understand that we can't take these prophecies and now apply them in a literal way. We don't talk about Babylon as being, Iraq. Babylon is the kingdoms of this world. Specifically, we can talk about Babylon, the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. But we have Mystery Babylon, the mother of harlots, the Catholic Church, right? So they're symbols. It doesn't make sense to take the king of the north and to look at Syria and the king of the south here and say this is Egypt, because those kingdoms have passed on, right? Greece is no longer there, right? Rome conquers Greece. Rome becomes the king of the north. The papacy inherits that title. The king of the south represents these characteristics that then we would have to look at what nation has those characteristics. So as you'll see in Uriah Smith's, he's going to have three different powers here. France, with the king of the south, Egypt, pushing at him. And then the king of the north, Syria, in this case, really Turkey, coming against France. And that this is at the time of the end in 1798, right? So there's going to be a number of problems with this. But he is just reiterating Josiah Litch's understanding of this. So it's not something that he created. Okay, Dwight, you got... Yep. So hopefully that clarifies things for people, but we'll go through this in more detail.
After a long interval, the king of the south and the king of the north again appear on the stage of action. We have met with nothing to indicate that we are to look to any different localities for these powers from those which, shortly after the death of Alexander, constituted respectively the southern and northern divisions of his empire. So, as you're saying, Smith has had no original thought. He is just parroting that which he had found previously. Mm-hmm. Is it a fact that at the time of the end, Egypt did push or make a comparatively feeble resistance, while Turkey did come like a resistless whirlwind against him, that is, the government of France? So Smith asks a question here. How do we see this? Did Turkey come against France as a whirlwind?
In 1798?
1798 or 1799?
Well, I mean, the time of the end is 1798, as he points out.
Well, okay. So we have already produced some evidence that the time of the end commenced in 1798.
Yeah.
And no reader of history need be informed that in that very year, a state of open hostility between France and Egypt was inaugurated. The downfall of the papacy, which marked the termination of the 1260 years, and according to verse 35, showed the commencement of the time of the end, took place on the 10th of February of 1798, when Rome fell into the hands of Berthier, the general of the French. On the 5th of March following, Bonaparte received the decree of the Directory relative to the expedition against Egypt. May 3rd, he left Paris and set sail the 19th with a large naval armament containing 40,000 soldiers and 10,000 sailors. July 5th, Alexandria was taken and immediately fortified. On July 23rd, the decisive Battle of the Pyramids was fought, in which the Mamelukes contested the field with valor and desperation, but were no match for the disciplined legions of the French. Murad Bey lost all his cannon, 400 camels, 3,000 men. The loss of the French was comparatively slight. On the 24th of July, Bonaparte entered Cairo, the capital of Egypt. Thus, the king of the south was able to make but a feeble resistance.
Okay, so a couple of little problems. So pushing is not a resistance.
Right.
Right. So when we deal with pushing in Daniel 11, verse 40, what is the imagery there? What would it mean to push?
Well, if you compare it to how Daniel used it previously in chapter 8, when he's discussing Media Persia, it's like a victorious surge. I would describe it as it's conquering and continuing to conquer.
Right. So Egypt is not attacking France in 1798, correct? Egypt isn't pushing.
No.
Right. France is pushing.
Yes.
Okay.
Egypt basically tries to resist, but basically hits a brick wall. It doesn't doesn't push France one iota.
Exactly. So it'd be hard to say that the king of the south, Egypt's push is at him being France, because that doesn't happen. But we do have France pushing at him being the king of the north, and the king of the north being the papacy, right?
Okay.
So this pushing, it's the word itself, 5055, is in Daniel 8, verse 4, right? So the ram's going to push, right? So that's the ram conquering, I gotta look at it. So pushing westward, northward, southward, right? So that's Media Persia conquering its territory from Babylon, right?
I think Lydia and Egypt.
Okay, Nubia and Egypt. Okay,
So
well, that's but the point is that's pushing. It means to push or thrust or gore, right? So I wouldn't say that word is feeble resistance. So he just says, oh, it's feeble resistance, pushing, but it doesn't make any sense for what he's describing historically. Okay.
So at this juncture, however, the situation of Napoleon began to grow complicated. The French fleet, which was his only channel of communication with France, was defeated by the English under Nelson at Abukir. And on September 2nd of the same year, 1798, the Sultan of Turkey, exasperated that Egypt, so long a semi-dependency of the Ottoman Empire, should be transformed into a French province, declared war against France. Thus the king of the north came against him in the same year that the king of the south pushed, and both at the time of the end, which is another conclusive proof that the year 1798 is the one which begins the period. How do we view this? Is this truly a conclusive proof?
Well, definitely not. So coming against him like a whirlwind, that's not really what happens. But anyway, he's going to go on dealing with this whirlwind part.
Okay.
So he's going to compare the pushing and the whirlwind, the pushing being a feeble resistance.
Now, is this portion relative to Turkey also part of what the pioneers had believed, or is this something that Smith is pushing of his own volition?
Well, this is Josiah Litch.
Okay.
Right. So this is what Josiah Litch taught. It's not what Miller taught specifically, though Miller's. So if we deal with, let me see if I can find this here quickly. Well, just read this. I'll get to Miller's statements here.
Okay. Was the coming of the king of the north, or Turkey, like a whirlwind in comparison with the pushing of Egypt? Napoleon had crushed the armies of Egypt. He essayed to do the same thing with the armies of the Sultan, who were menacing an attack from the side of Asia. February 27th, 1799, with 18,000 men, he commenced his march from Cairo to Syria. He first took the fort of El Arish in the desert, then Jaffa, the Joppa of the Bible, conquered the inhabitants of Napolis at Zeta, and was again victorious at Japhet. Meanwhile, a strong body of Turks had entrenched themselves at Saint Jean d'Acre, while the swarms of Mussulmen gathered in the mountains of Samaria, ready to swoop down upon the French when they should besiege d'Acre. Sir Sidney Smith at the same time appeared before Saint Jean d'Acre with 2 English ships, reinforced the Turkish garrison of that place, and captured the apparatus for the siege, which Napoleon had sent round by sea from Alexandria. A Turkish fleet soon appeared in the offing, which, with the Russian and English vessels then cooperating with them, constituted the many ships of the King of the North. So it's kind of interesting to read that viewpoint on this history.
Yes. So first we say that the pushing, Egypt doesn't push, but to say that it came against them like a whirlwind, I mean, I don't see a whirlwind here.
No.
Right? I mean, one is we see, so he says here, like a whirlwind in comparison to the pushing of Egypt. Well, obviously Egypt didn't really push. So he's going to have this February 27, 1799, with 18,000 men, commenced his march from Cairo to Syria. So I don't know. I don't see how he fits this in. I mean, he's got the many ships of the King of the North. But, again, we would have to understand this all symbolically. We wouldn't take this in a literal sense.
Okay.
Because, I mean, is there going to be chariots involved in the literal, and horsemen and ships? He's talking about the ships, literally.
Horsemen, possibly. Chariots, no.
No, right? So obviously we'd have to look at these as symbolic. But, I mean, yeah, there's just so many problems with this. Now, just to go back to what we were talking about with Miller, here's what Miller says about verse 40. So he's going to talk about at the time of the end. What may we understand by the end? I understand the end of the 1260, right? So which year in power ended, as we shall presently show, in the year 1798, but we will follow the angel in his prophecy. And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, and with many ships. And he shall enter into the countries, and shall overflow many, and pass over. It will be necessary for the reader to observe, and for me to remark in this place, that the inspired writers, in their descriptions of kingdoms or principal governments, use the pronouns he or him, instead of naming them, as in the preceding description of Antichrist, or as Paul uses in 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 7. And many other places might be named. Therefore, I understand the pronouns in the above named 40th verse, and those following in the chapter, to refer to the same kingdom, or principal ruler in said kingdom, and that the angel has reference to the principal kingdom of the 10 kingdoms into which the Roman was divided when Antichrist arose, which shall hate the whore and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her and burn her with fire. If this is correct, then France is intended by the he or him. So he does have France be the he or the him here in this verse. Now, the way that he does that, do you understand what he's saying here and how he does that? It's quite a bit different than what Uriah Smith does.
Okay. Refresh our minds, please.
So he says it's the principal kingdom of the 10 kingdoms into which the Roman was divided when Antichrist arose. So
Right.
he's still going to have 36 to 39 referring to the papacy.
All right.
Okay. But then he's going to say, well, this is the kingdom of the Roman kingdom, and it's going to be the he or the him, in this case, is going to be the principal kingdom of the 10 divisions of the Roman Empire. So it's very different in how he places France here. So Uriah Smith is following the example of Josiah Litch, but here Miller has a different view. So they're still going to have the three parties. They're still going to have Egypt and Syria. Now his is a little bit different because he says he's actually going to have Spain pushing at France, the Vendéan War, and the king of the north here being Great Britain. So he's actually going to be different in that regard, but he's going to have them coming against France. So he's going to have Spain coming against France and Great Britain coming against France. So he's not going to be using Egypt and Syria. The glorious land he's going to have is Italy, and he's going to have Edom, Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon referred to the Ottomans and Eastern nations, when we get further down. Okay, is that helpful?
I would think so. Okay, now comment from the chat. Thank you, Stephen. Smith had France's battle against Egypt on the 23rd of July. Online sources generally give it as being July 21st. So it's interesting the difference in, here is Smith not long after these battles having a very different date, yet here is other sources currently that are giving a different time frame. Now, on the 18th of March, the siege commenced. Napoleon was twice called away to save some French divisions from falling into the hand of the Mussulman hordes that filled the country. Twice also a breach was made in the wall of the city, but the assailants were met with such fury by the garrison that they were obliged, despite their best efforts, to give over the struggle. After a continuance of 60 days, Napoleon raised the siege, sounded for the first time in his career a note of retreat, and on the 21st of May commenced to retrace his steps to Egypt. So, what do we see here? We see that Napoleon was able to be defeated, but did Islam, Turkey, truly defeat him, or did Napoleon make a strategic decision to withdraw?
Yeah, and definitely, this isn't the fulfillment of the prophecy. So one of the things that we have addressed, that we've understood by studying Daniel chapter 11, is that, or Daniel's last vision, is that Daniel is being given an understanding of the 2520 prophetic mirror.
Yes.
Right. He's being given the time of the end, and also the time appointed. Right. So we have the time of the end, 1798, the time appointed, October 22nd, 1844. And he's also given the fact that there are two times at the end, that there's going to be a repetition of the history of 1798 in the future, which we put as 1989. So this movement is built upon this understanding of Daniel 11, verse 40, that the time of the end in 1798 and the time of the end in 1989 are being described in that verse, and that the repetition of Millerite history that Jeff first discovers in 1989, as he continues to study, he comes to realize that actually began in 1989. that the parable of the 10 virgins being repeated, or having been fulfilled in the past, will be repeated to the very letter. So Ellen White says, has been fulfilled and will be fulfilled to the very letter, right? So it has been fulfilled in the past, and it's fulfilled in our time. So there are people in this movement who are in Africa, I understand, struggling over this. Because people reading Uriah Smith, some people are taking the side of Uriah Smith. And we know that Jeff is sending money for this. Well, he sent money and helped organize this camp meeting where they had this discussion. I don't know what the result of it was, thinking that the discussion was over something else. But really, they're studying this, trying to understand this, or different people trying to promote their views. I'm not sure exactly all the details. But we know that this is the foundation of this message. So if this is wrong, if Uriah Smith was correct, then this message has no foundation. But also, we can see that it is really the foundation, this understanding here, of Millerite history, which was sealed up and now is unsealed in our history. And we've seen that. We've seen as we've gone through Daniel chapter 11, that this repeat of history is described before verse 40, right? So we have that in verse 35. And some of them of understanding shall fall, to try them, to purge them, to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. And so we tied that together with that history, right? And then of Millerite history, and then it's repeated. That word "yet" is talking about a repetition. So anyway, it's here. I understand why Uriah Smith has this view. He's just repeating what he has understood from the pioneer writings, but he's chosen Josiah Litch over Miller.
Right.
And maybe, and he's not telling us this. He's not saying that, well, Josiah Litch and Miller had a different view. But, part of that's just not the way that things were done then. I mean, we do things differently now. We're a bit more thorough in that we're showing people what has actually happened, what different views exist, and why we take the position that we do. He's just sort of presenting his view that he understands.
He entitles his chapter "A Literal Prophecy."
Right.
And he basically just continues that for the whole chapter.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that it has more of a literal application. We don't see so much symbolism. And therefore, he thinks it's just the whole way through. There's no real symbolism. It's just telling you the events literally. Yeah.
So he starts with that assumption that it's all just literal all the way through. But we can see that it can't be. And it's kind of difficult to take that position that he does, because that's different than Miller. Miller is not going to say, well, the king of the south is Egypt and the king of the north is Syria, right? He's going to have the king of the north being Great Britain, which is kind of odd, and the king of the south being Spain. But we have good reasons why the king of the south is spiritualism, right? Which we then would say is in the time of the end embodied by France, right? It's Sodom and Egypt, because we have that comparison in Revelation chapter 11 with France. And the king of the north being the papacy, we definitely have clear that this is a battle between the king of the south pushing against the king of the north, the papacy, and then the papacy coming back. Plus, we have the other fact that Louis F. Weir in the 1950s and 60s clearly understood what Daniel 11 verse 40b was, how it was going to be fulfilled. Not as to the time, but as to how. And so in 1989, when the Soviet Union fell, we could clearly see that Lewis F. Weir was correct. He didn't label it the time of the end, but he still was correct that Daniel 11, verse 40b was fulfilled by that event of the fall of the Soviet Union. And he predicted how that was going to come about, an alliance between the United States and the papacy.
Well, I don't know if he explicitly sort of connected with the United States, but he said certainly Christendom. So maybe certainly including the United States.
No, he does actually say the United States in one place.
Right, okay.
Yeah, he does specifically talk about the United States. Yeah. I can't remember if he calls it America or the United States, but he does. So, because he wrote quite a bit about it, but at different times, right? So, where do you get the one where he just talks about Christendom? Which paper is that in?
I think that's something about the King of the North.
Yeah. So there's another paper. Because there's quite a few different. There's Kings from the Sun Rising. Try to remember which one it is. Could be in The Woman and the Resurrected Beast. Anyway, he's got a few different papers. I'll find the statement so that we have it. Okay, go on, Dwight.
And he shall overflow and pass over. We have found events which furnish a very striking fulfillment of the pushing of the king of the south and the whirlwind onset of the king of the north against the French power. Thus far, there is quite a general agreement in the application of the prophecy. But now we reach a point where a difference of opinion exists. To whom do the words, he shall overflow and pass over, refer? Now, it's interesting, in all of the studies and all of the comments that we've had on this previously, how this point is so convoluted by Smith. To France or the king of the north? Is that to whom he shall overflow and pass over referring? The application of the remainder of this chapter depends upon the answer to this question. From this point, two lines of interpretation diverge. Some apply the words to France and endeavor to find a fulfillment in the career of Napoleon. Others apply them to the king of the north and accordingly point for a fulfillment to the events in the history of Turkey. If neither of these positions is free from difficulty, as we presume no one will claim that it is, absolutely, it will only remains that we take the one which presents the fewest. Now, Smith is overlooking a lot of situations here. Now, comment in the chat. Someday in the not too distant future, the forces of atheistic communism will be temporarily subdued by the combined forces of Christendom. Preparing for the Close of Probation by Lewis F. Weir, 1957.
Yeah, so that's the quote Stephen's thinking of.
Right. So Smith is giving a tacit reference to Miller's rules, but it's very indirect. It's almost like saying, yeah, this is a way of looking at it, but there's a better way. So here we stand today. In our understanding, we have come and are addressing this from the point that Rome establishes the vision. Thereby, Rome is the king of the north. If this is the case, then it is the atheistic nation that has progressed from Egypt to France to Russia that would then be the king of the south. But Smith is not seeing it in that regard. His premise is that the king of the north is to be Turkey and the king of the south is to and remains as Egypt. I have difficulty with what Smith is presenting. Where do the rest of us stand?
Okay, so now I know that Smith is going to have some unique ideas as he starts to make predictions about events that are going to happen based upon that he believes that this is Turkey, right? So he's saying that that's going to provide the fewest difficulties, right? Is that what we understand? That it's
Right.
going.
That's what I would see.
Yeah. Now, so some had taken this as being referring to France, or the king of the north. Now, right, of course, the king of the south, he's not applying. People who apply to the king of the south, some people apply the king of the south, I believe, to Islam or something. I'm not sure how they do that. There's so many different interpretations of these verses floating around. But people bring in Islam. I'm not sure how they bring Islam into this. That is, I've seen different views. But some people will have Islam as the king of the south. Anyway, we see that this can't possibly be correct. It's also really if there's difficulties, what does Miller say? If we find that everything doesn't fit, then we have a wrong interpretation.
Right.
Right. So Smith should maybe see that there's a problem with this interpretation, that everything hasn't fit perfectly. I mean, if you were, a computer programmer and you had these two programs to operate, and one has a bunch of errors in it, the other one has a bunch, but you're going to run the one that has the least amount of errors. I don't think that would be wise. You would have to have something that's free from errors, right?
But you'd hope so.
So here, what we have tried to do is we've tried to have no contradictions in God's word to what we see happening prophetically. So he's saying basically there's just two positions, right? And that one of them must be right. And we have to take the one that has the fewest difficulties. So he's going to address, of course, those points.
Okay. Now Smith continues. Respecting the application of the prophecy to Napoleon or to France under his leadership, so far as we are acquainted with his history, we do not find events which we can urge with any degree of assurance as the fulfillment of the remaining portion of this chapter. And hence we do not see how it can be thus applied. It must then be fulfilled by Turkey, unless it can be shown, one, that the expression of the king of the north does not apply to Turkey, or two, that there is some other power beside France or the king of the north which fulfilled this part of the prediction. But if Turkey, now occupying the territory which constituted the northern division of Alexander's empire, is not the king of the north of this prophecy, then we are left without any principle to guide us in the interpretation. And we presume at all will be agreed that there is no room for the introduction of any other power here. The French king and the king of the north are the only ones to whom the prediction can apply. The fulfillment must lie between them. So Smith's premise, then we are left without any principle to guide us in the interpretation. It drips of ego, that Smith is right and others are wrong.
Well, I don't know about the ego part, but yeah, definitely Smith is wrong.
The position on which he is standing, that he's trying to build up, is not really on solid ground.
Yeah, and that's and the way that he builds his arguments is really a problem that I have with Smith. And I had this problem when I read his book on the state of the dead. So this was a long time ago when I was first an Adventist. I read his book. I can't remember the title of it, but I just didn't like the way that he presented his arguments. That it was, as I've said before, highly polemical, very argumentative, little bit condescending, a bit of mockery here and there, right? Which I don't really think is suitable in presenting Bible truth. I mean, God can mock if he chooses, right? But I don't think it's up to us to mock.
Okay.
Right? I mean, God can mock the wicked and so forth. But as human beings, I don't think that we're in that position to mock, to put ourselves above others. And so the way that he presents his arguments they're not open and clear. They're not left for us to decide. He's using rhetorical tools to sort of push you to agree with him instead of just presenting the evidence and allowing you to dispassionately evaluate the information and make a decision.
Okay.
And a lot of times it's just how he frames the information that you're not even aware sometimes that he's doing it. Here he's framed it in such a way that he's given you a false dichotomy, two different choices. And well, you're going to have to pick this choice because this one's the better one. And like here he says, but if Turkey, now occupying the territory which constituted the northern division of Alexander's kingdom, is not the king of the north of this prophecy, then we are left without any principle to guide us in the interpretation, which of course is not true, right?
Right.
We do have a principle to guide us in the interpretation. And that is, we understand these things to be figurative because they're at the end of the world. The literal has now become typical. The king of the north in the battle and the king of the south, in the battle between the king of the north and the king of the south in Greece, become symbols, right? And we've seen that, the battle of Raphia, the battle of Panium. That is, the battle of Raphia is typifying Daniel 11 verse 40a, and the battle of Panium is typifying Daniel 11 verse 40b, right? That's why the king of the north and the king of the south are being described there. It's tying you back to that history of the battle between the literal kings of the north and south, right?
Okay.
That's the best way to understand Daniel chapter 11, is that we have this previous history of literal kingdoms. So there is a literal aspect to those prophecies, but they are there to be typical of something that's going to happen later in Daniel 11. And it's giving us this information all the way through, but those little keys are missed.
All right. 2 comments from the chat. Islamic King of the South interpreters have Islam entering the chapter in verse 25, referring to the Crusades coming against the Islamic held Holy Land. Second comment, we can get Lewis F. Weir's preparing for the close of probation on academia, thanks to Theodore. So quite a bit, because Weir had a lot of things that he considered that we have been using within the movement for the last many years.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Lewis F. Weir's books were republished by Hans K. Larondel.
Okay.
Back in the 1980s. So I don't know if people know who he is.
I don't.
I've heard his name before.
Yeah, he's an Adventist theologian, and he writes lots against dispensationalism. But he had Lewis F. Weir's books republished. And because of that, they're actually hard to get on the internet because they're copyrighted. Right? That is, you have to find other versions of it. But usually you just run into Hans K. Larondel's, Larondel is like L,H-I-R, Larondel. Some kind of French name. Larondel? I don't know how you say it. But anyway, that's why they're hard to find.
Okay. Smith continues. Some considerations certainly favor the idea that there is, in the latter part of verse 40, a transfer of the burden of the prophecy from the French power to the king of the north. The king of the north is introduced just before as coming forth like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, and many ships. The collision between this power and the French we have already noticed. King of the North, with the aid of his allies, gained the day in this contest, and the French, foiled in their efforts, were driven back into Egypt. Now it would seem to be the more natural application to refer the overflowing and passing over to that power which emerged in triumph from the struggle, and that power was Turkey. We will only add that one who is familiar with the Hebrew assures us that the construction of this verse is such as to make it necessary to refer to the overflowing and passing over to the king of the north. These words expressing the result of that movement, which is just before likened to the fury of a whirlwind. Now, thus concludes Smith's commentary on verses 39 and 40. Here, he wants to make reference to a party that is familiar with the Hebrew, but doesn't wish to tell us who it is. He tries to reinforce his position and change things going from one party, France, to another party, Turkey, but the entire premise that he's using is not without issue. And if we're using Miller's rules, this should have been set aside without question.
Yeah. Though, I mean, the one that overflows and passes over is the king of the north.
Right.
Right.
Okay. Comment again with the chat. Okay. We have
Okay, you can get his old Lewis F. Weir stuff on Adventist Digital Library now.
interesting.
Yeah. Never used to be able to. So the one book that's really good is The Moral Purpose of Prophecy. If you click on there. It's not all of his books, but it's some of them. And
Okay. Any other thoughts or comments?
I was looking for that quote by Ellen White, a couple of quotes about Uriah Smith and how she esteemed him as editor. Unfortunately, I read it in a hard copy book and I don't have it with me, so I'll have to put that one on the back burner until I can figure it out in the archives.
Okay. Well, as we are coming close to the close of our time together today, I don't know that it's prudent for us to begin looking at the last of these articles that Smith wrote on Daniel 11. Do we have any other comment regarding what we've covered today? Anything else that we need to address?
Kind of an aside, but last night I had a conversation with a young fellow and he figured out I was a Christian and he said, yeah, I'm looking at that stuff. And I said, yeah, we've been studying the book of Daniel for quite a while. He said, my friend told me to study that book, to read that book. I said, oh, would you like to look at it with me? So we're going to be having a Bible study on it, Daniel, tonight. And this morning, my roommate, somehow the conversation came up. Oh, dude, you only get like 3 hours sleep. I said, no, it was actually about 5. And said I've been making a practice lately of getting up at 6 a.m. to join a Bible study every morning for a while. And we've been studying Bible prophecy and stuff. And then I don't know how it got to it, but he wanted to know more, like the beast and the mark of the beast and stuff like that. And I said, well, I don't have, it's a long kind of explanation, but basically, and I told him the basics, and he was like, wow. So, I mean, it's just incredible the hunger that I find here for the Bible. They don't really realize it's for the Bible, but it's just such a field that's so ripe. It's amazing.
mm-hmm. Well, thanks, Kelly.
All right. So if we have no other comments, shall we then close this session in prayer? Gracious Father in heaven, we thank you for this opportunity that we've had to open your word, to consider carefully that which has been before us. Be with us now and direct us. Show us, Father, that you would have us to do, so that today we may glorify your name. Bless each one that has been in this meeting. Bless each that have participated. Help us now to look to you as the author and the finisher of our faith for all that you would have us to do. For this, we thank you and we praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.